Okay, hello. I want to welcome everybody out there, and alas, I cannot see you, but inspiringly, there are so many of you. I want to welcome you to the fourth and final session of Jews, Class, and History. This particular session looks at the period beginning in the 1980s and changes on the philanthropic landscape and the implications of that change. So I am Hasia Diner. I teach at New York University in the Department of History and in Hebrew and Judaic Studies. This is a series, this is again the fourth in a series hosted by Jewish Currents. It has been funded by the Goldstein Goren Center for American Jewish History in the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. I happen to be the director of that center. This conference was the brainchild of two spectacular PhD students, Hadass Binyamini and Natalia Shevin, and all praise should go to them. Originally, this series was to be a one-day conference at NYU, but obviously COVID upended our plans. But contingent faculty at NYU asked fellow academics not to host conferences at institutions whose COVID policy exacerbated continuing inequities within the academy. So, in solidarity with our contingent faculty's call, conference organizers Hadass and Natalia worked together with Jewish Currents to provide a new home and to shift the locus of the proceedings. So it should make no difference to you who's hosting, but I do hope that it is a great learning experience. I'm about to get off, but I will come back at the end, but I want to turn over I guess it's not exactly a microphone, to Rebecca Pierce, who is a writer and filmmaker based in San Francisco. Her writings have appeared in Jewish Currents, The Nation, The New Republic, the Jewish Daily Forward, and she takes over from here on in. So enjoy.
Thank you so much, Hasia. So to get our panel started, I first want to introduce our amazing panelists. Lila Corwin Berman is a professor of history at Temple University and author of The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution. Her articles have appeared in scholarly and popular publications, including the American Historical Review and the Washington Post. Amy Schiller is a Dartmouth Society of Fellows postdoctoral fellow. She researches, consults, and writes about the role of philanthropy in contemporary society. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, the Washington Post, and The Nation. Finally, Catherine Acey is the Director of Strategic Collaborations at Griot Circle, an LGBTQ Elders of Color organization based in Brooklyn. Previously, she served as an Associate Director of North Star Fund, Executive Director of Austria Lesbian Fellowship for Justice, and Senior Activist Fellow Emerita at the Barnard Center for Research on Women. So thank you all for joining us. I think we're going to get into a really interesting discussion. In this roundtable, we're going to be focusing on the relationships between philanthropy, American capitalism, social movements in the state, with a particular focus on the 80s and 90s. And so this was a period, in the Reagan and later moderate Democratic administrations where there was a lot of privatization of public services. Financialization of the free market was really worshipped in this period, and neoliberal public policy really came to the fore. So I'd like to ask all of our panelists, and any of you can comment who feels interested or able to comment, how did philanthropy's relationships to the government, their donors, and the communities they serve change in the light of these economic and political developments?
So this is Catherine. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Jewish Currents, for inviting me to be part of the conversation this evening. As Rebecca said, public foundations, North Star Fund, as well as the Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice, and still continue. And while I am not any longer with those organizations, I still have a toe in the philanthropy, the organized philanthropy world. When we talk about the 80s and 90s, my experience was really entrenched in the women's, feminist, LGBTQ and left progressive public foundations. And the public foundations emerged and out of really some of the 60s, 70s, but really began to mature and grow in the 80s. And they grew out of, grew out of social movements, were connected to social movements and to communities. They were very identity-based, but with an intersectional analysis and approach. And so it was kind of the embracing of the identity and a very social justice progressive approach. Also, they were movement building. They were focused on organizing, public policy, as well as base building, as opposed to funding services. Not that services were not needed or respected, but these types of foundations actually focused on structural change. Another thing that set them aside is that they did not really partner in most cases with government. In fact, they were funding groups that were advocating and agitating, if you will, against government or to promote government to actually step up. This is, again, as Rebecca mentioned, this was a period where privatization, neoliberalism, which still exists today, was very striking. And so these different entities were focused on making that kind of structural change. They also, besides being public foundations with the identity groups, they were very networked and very collaborative. That's not to say within these different entities or networks, there were pressures and tensions, disagreements, and some of that fell out around race, as you might imagine, gender, sexual orientation. But those networks, some of them still exist today.
Thank you for that. And just a reminder for everyone watching, please submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom. Lila, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. Catherine, that was so interesting to hear about those experiences. So I'm a historian and have thought a lot about kind of the longer and maybe broader forces that created the conditions for the rise of both public charities and private foundations. And when I've kind of thought about the 80s and all of those different forces that Rebecca just set out, in many ways, I think that philanthropy was like ahead of the curve. That philanthropy is really quite specifically the divestment of private goods, like my private property, for the public good. So we could see it on one hand as a process of making something that was private public, but in the way that I think it was ahead of the curve in terms of the 1980s, we could also see it as really a form of privatization, right? So taking the public and imposing on it the will of the private, right? And so those kinds of forces that become, I think, really amplified in the 1980s were, in a sense, already being wrestled with or grappled with in the very structure of American philanthropy. And the question, in a sense, really always is whether philanthropy leans more toward empowering the private or empowering the public, right? And I think in the American context, we need to think of this really as a kind of contest between ideals of capitalism and ideals of democracy, right? So we could certainly say that philanthropy is a creature of democracy, and it seeks to use its resources to empower the public. And some of what you were talking about, Catherine, I think really exemplifies that. I would say that was probably relatively countercultural in the world of philanthropy in the 1980s, and remains so. Because we also, I think, need to think about philanthropy as a creature of capitalism, right? That would seek to use private resources to empower the private and impose the private on the public, right? And what we really see in the 1980s is philanthropy, I think, quite clearly settling into favoring market capitalism. We see this in terms of how endowments are being built. That is, piles of money that are intended to sit and grow through investment in the market economy. And intended only to circulate at a very small percentage. Usually the orthodoxy is like no more than 5%, right? The growth of them tends to be well above that. And we can also see philanthropy favoring market capitalism through tax policies, right? That especially in the 1980s with the changes to the tax code that happened under the Reagan administration, that tended to favor wealthy people, both in terms of the actual tax code and also in terms of how exemptions and deductions worked. And the last little piece I'll add is that I think one of the kinds of specific pieces of language that Reagan was so fond of using, and people have looked at his political speeches, was the word freedom, right? Freedom appeared as the sort of centerpiece of what Reagan was selling to America. And, you know, in his vision, there were these kinds of twin ideals of freedom and progress, that really progress only could be achieved through a kind of freedom. And the way that Reagan talked about freedom and his administration talked about freedom was very privatized and very personalized. And it was enacted through tax cuts. It was enacted through the shrinkage of social welfare and through the kind of rhetoric of individualism and self-actualization. And it also had to do with this idea of liberating the markets, liberating capitalism to sort of do its business without interference. But at the same time, and I'll end at this point, at the same time, really harnessing actually the government to prop up market growth and private rights. And we see this sculpting philanthropy in a really particular way, right? That philanthropy is not just a relationship between the individual and how they decide to enact the public good. Philanthropy is itself an instrument of the state, right? And it's the state telling private entities that you have the freedom, you have the right to go and do what you want to do within certain parameters with the actual subsidy of the public. And so it's a very interesting and complicated way of thinking about who gets freedom and who is kind of subject to that kind of freedom.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating. Amy, is there anything you want to add for this question?
Well, obviously, those are really spectacular and very comprehensive responses. And I just want to say thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be in this very esteemed company. Lila, it is so, it's sort of lovely to me that you framed it very correctly, philanthropy as being ahead of the curve, because in so many ways, I think the framework of philanthropic institutions reflecting and reinforcing those political economic shifts very much holds true. And yet also, I think philanthropy, my sense is that in some ways it reflects larger political economic trends and these ideologies on a lag. I think that there are ways in which these ideologies that really were seeded in this time period in the 1980s, you really see them flowering and really pervading the philanthropic practices and the philanthropic vocabularies and the philanthropic discourses like 1 to 2 decades later. So you see, and I'm going to name 2 specific examples. So really it's in the 90s and then into the 2000s and today, where within philanthropic interactions and within philanthropic conversations and appeals and strategies, those two are being shaped and changed by these ideologies. So one example of that would be what really happened to a large degree in the 90s and through today is the reframing of philanthropy and philanthropic giving as resembling an investment, resembling practices of investment and evaluating it based on its ability to generate some kind of measurable return. So that entire framework absolutely has its roots in these ideologies around the free market and around neoliberalism and financialization. Their sort of takeover of philanthropic practices happens, like it really comes to light more in the 1990s and then through today, which is when you have the emergence of terms like venture philanthropy, which then becomes philanthrocapitalism, right? Which then becomes a whole worldview of trying to make philanthropic giving more closely resemble market transactions that are more and more familiar, and in fact more and more sort of exclusive of all other mentalities certainly among the donor class. And then the second example that I would give to illustrate that is the changing role of federations, because Jewish federations offer this bundling of, and they're this sort of mediating institution that had a very singular role to play, much the way the United Way has, right, in kind of secular society. So what a federation will do is say, like, we are the clearinghouse and we are the experts, and we evaluate and allocate this communal pot of money to the variety of needs that exist within our community. And that rests on gifts that are unrestricted, right? That really give a lot of decision-making power to the federation themselves, right? Federations themselves. And what you see, again, I think in terms of like philanthropic practices, you see this eye towards financialization and really being more analytical and more calculating about, like, what is the return on each dollar and how am I going to quantify that as a donor, and how are you going to prove that to me in some way that feels replicative of my role as investor, right? And the same thing plays out in federations, where rather than giving an unrestricted gift to this like bundling institution, there's now this real demand for more oversight, more discretionary giving, more restricted giving, that sort of back to that question of individual agency that Lila brought up, again, sort of heightens the power of the individual donor to be to really have more power over what their gift is intended to do, and to really use the institutions more as their mechanism for fulfilling their philanthropic interests, rather than a sort of collective effort in which there's a bundled amount of money that's used for these this sort of communal list of needs.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating, and I think really helps kind of set up our next question. So we have this sort of really fascinating background that the three of you have set up about the roles that these institutions are taking. And I think I want to dive a little bit deeper into like the Jewish community in particular. We know that a lot of these nonprofit foundations and funds really influence a lot of Jewish institutional life today in a very strong way. I'd like to hear from all of you about how did philanthropies come to play this defining role in Jewish communal life, and what are the implications of having a community be so dependent on this specific sort of financial and legal framework of these bodies? Lila, do you want to go?
Sure, I can jump in. So, one thing that I think is really important in thinking about this question about, like, how did these private sources of money come to be so definitive of Jewish life? Again, and like I might start to sound like a broken record with this, but is that you can't think of this absent the American state, right? So like one question that people sometimes ask, and I was just really quickly looking at the Q&A and it looks like somebody might have asked that even, is like, how new is this, right? Like we kind of know that wealth and power go together, and like, is there ever a time when it hasn't been the case, when there've been these sort of big men who control a lot of the shots? And on a certain level, yeah, I suppose that we could say something like that. But what is historically interesting to me, I think, is the distinctive ways that particular contexts and contingencies actually shape the way that power works at different moments in time, right? And so in the case of looking at American Jewish life in the 20th century, one of the kind of clear contexts are the policies of the American state, right? And so the fact that Jewish philanthropic dollars, funneled through this particular legal structure that we've been discussing, means that the way that Jewish communal life is structured also has that kind of imprint of state policy, right? And so it really ties American Jews to the American state. And when I say the American state, I mean everything from different governing agencies like state and federal, right, to courts, to lawmakers and policymakers and heads of agencies, and all sorts of things like that. And so what I have found in my research, for example, like some of the dynamics that Amy was talking about, the shift that happens in Jewish federations, right, where the kind of basic logic of a Jewish federation was that lots of donors would give money, some would give a lot and some not as much, but that every year there would be an annual cycle of allocation, right? And the process would kind of be legitimated by whether the donors gave again the next year, right? But over time, kind of in concert with shifts happening in American political economy, also the fact that American Jews rise in their socioeconomic class, also I think as a sort of post-Holocaust consciousness, there becomes more and more appetite to restrict funds, to hold back funds, to build endowments, even in federations, right? For a whole host of reasons that we could get into later. But what this means is that increasingly Jewish federations, and this is, so I'm talking about, say, in the 1950s, 1960s, right? Before there are lots of private family foundations that are Jewish, like, you know, created by Jewish families, Jewish federations start to feel like it's important for them to address what the needs of their donors are and the desires to have more of this kind of individualized giving and restricted giving happening, and start to then really actually advocate for policy changes in front of American lawmakers, right? And so, you know, start to have this kind of negotiation back and forth about really what is good for Jewish philanthropy, or what's good for philanthropy more generally, and what that should look like in terms of shifts in the tax code even. And so these kinds of conversations or dialogues between Jewish philanthropic bodies and American state institutions end up like really having a way that they shape Jewish communal life, right? And like creating a strong link between state policy and what happens in Jewish communal life, in ways that, you know, I think sometimes might be surprising, because they would run contrary to some of our assumptions about, like, you know, liberal ideals or social justice ideals that the majority of American Jews would have subscribed to at a particular moment. And yet there's this whole kind of economic world of how philanthropy works and how Jewish philanthropic organizations are advocating for certain kinds of tax policies that are quite contrary to some of those kinds of ideals, right? And so, you know, I think you start to see, even in the 1950s, 1960s, this kind of tension in, I would say, in American Jewish politics that is sort of being pushed ahead because of this, on one hand, this kind of economic model, and on the other hand, you know, some of the kind of social justice or liberal kinds of commitments that many American Jews have. And so, you know, I think it creates like a great deal of tension in terms of how philanthropy operates in Jewish life.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Amy, do you want to add to the conversation?
Yeah, those are great points. I'm using the written version of this question, because the phrasing is really helpful here, where the question is, how do philanthropies come to define Jewish communal life, and what are the implications of having a whole community dependent on a single financial legal body? So that question already gets at like the main challenge of modern Jewish life period, which is, how are we defining community? And where are those boundaries? So defining Jewish communal life is a bit predicated on there even being a single defined Jewish community. And in fact, there's actually a way in which that like mid 20th century model of the federations were really the only mechanism by which Jews could support other Jews qua Jews, not sharing a worship preference, not sharing an educational preference, not sharing a cultural or an ethnic or a background, but and really using the sense of shared proximity and geography as the organizing principle of what it is that connected Jews outside of their other sort of more subdivided and subcultural communal institutions. So the way that has changed and the reason that that's important for the relationship between how we form community, how we define community, and how much that's shaped by money is that now I think it's less so much that we have singular entities, because I think that actually is sort of an older model. We don't have really those like singular identifiable entities that that kind of cover the whole spectrum of a Jewish community by geographic definition or otherwise. What you have now are a more concentrated agenda. So there's a sense more of like, it's more that it's about setting the agenda, and a sort of shared set of norms and a shared set of assumptions about like, well, what do we, the philanthropists, feel the priorities of the Jewish people should be? So I find it to be, how do they define Jewish communal life? It's a bit tautological in a way, because philanthropies define Jewish communal life as whatever they now want Jewish communal life to be and to look like. And in terms of Jewish communal life, more broad, by the broadest definition of what includes Jews, because every other Jewish institution addresses the Jewish people as some specific kind of Jew. And these communal institutions address us all as with this sense of peoplehood. So I think that's like that's where the two really become closely knit together.
Thanks so much. Catherine, did you want to weigh in? It looks like you're muted.
Sorry about that. I guess more of a question to Lila and Amy is, do you see any, as you're both reframing this, because I am not as versed in the communal philanthropy within the Jewish community, but there are a number of things that you were underscoring that felt like they could apply in general to philanthropy. And I'm wondering if in your work you've seen that, to draw that connections, so it's not just Jewish communal philanthropy in institutions.
I think that's a great question. I'm happy to start, and then Amy, I'm curious what you think too. There's so much that connects Jewish philanthropy to the broader world of American philanthropy. And, there's kind of like a little bit of a debate, like among historians, do we talk about American Jewish history or Polish Jewish history or any kind of Jewish history, as being this unique, distinctive Jewish thing, or really as being more about exemplifying some kind of features in whatever context it is. So I think, we could sort of do both, right? You don't have to choose one or the other, but one thing that I think might be interesting to discuss that does seem to kind of give some specific contours to American Jewish philanthropy is the effect of the kind of, post-Holocaust moment of raising money. This is not just something that bears the imprint of, a particular Jewish experience, because it's walking in tandem with changes happening in American political economy. But a shift I was really interested in is, prior to World War II, the primary concerns of Jewish philanthropic bodies had to do with satisfying material needs, right? And, you can imagine the reasons that was the case. You had massive waves of immigrants coming in, people who, needed to get trained for vocations, people who needed education, people who came with very, very little, needed to be settled. And so the way that, thinking about Federation, for example, the way that it thought about its money was really about circulating the funds to satisfy immediate material needs. As the status of American Jews shift, which I gather has been part of the discussions that preceded this one and in this series, on one hand, Jews have more access to abundance and more money that they can imagine giving to Jewish philanthropic organizations. And because of immigration restriction that happens in the 1920s, and then because of a very isolationist time in American history, you don't have nearly the number of immigrants coming in, and there aren't those kinds of constant Jewish material needs on the domestic scene. And in this post-World War II period, then you have American Jews confronting the fact that a third of world Jewry has been killed, right? And there's this shift that I was able to see in tracing, archival documents of different philanthropic institutions, where there's like this moment of crisis, like, what are we going to do with this abundance? What are we going to do with these institutions? There aren't these material needs, and yet there's this huge kind of existential need, right? There's this huge trauma. And you have at the same time, like, side note, the American state is building up on these New Deal ideals of more social welfare, more money going to the kinds of programs that Jewish philanthropic agencies also might have dealt with and now can get federal grants for. Okay, so what is the kind of answer to all of this? And the discourse, and Amy, when you were talking, I was thinking about this a lot, that the idea of funding identity, of funding peoplehood, of funding Jews to be Jews, of creating some way that philanthropy can act as a guarantor of the Jewish future, I think really becomes the sort of animating ideal of post-World War II American Jewish philanthropy. And we could talk about all of the other political economy. It's so hard for me, like, not to go to that, like, larger American historical context, but there's something to be said in just pausing in that moment, right? Saying, like, what does it mean that in this period, say we get to the 60s, the 70s, you start to have Jewish institutions building up endowments in ways that they, in fact, by their bylaws had not done so. It's really this sense that, maybe this money can guarantee that the Jewish people will survive, right? And that language of Jewish survival, right, becomes so percussive also in this period. So that's like one kind of dynamic I would set forth as being, a distinctive one, of course, intersecting with other kinds of contexts and contingencies, but quite a distinctive one, I think, necessary to understand American Jewish philanthropy.
That's great. That's such a great framework of thinking about that shift from the material to the existential. I think really applicable and relevant. Catherine, to your very good question, my experience is that Jewish philanthropy is like all other philanthropy, except much more so, right? It's just this sort of more like concentrated and distilled and fraught. And, because we're a small population, and it all has a lot, there's so much tension and negotiation around even issues of gatekeeping, right? Around that sort of issue of the boundaries of community within this one subset of these larger populations that is undergoing these broader political economic shifts. So, like, for example, Lila, when you brought up that mid-century shift in sort of American Jewish and maybe global Jewish identity, or perspective, I guess, on what it meant to be a Jew in a modern post-Holocaust world. One of my clients in consulting is a legacy organization called HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and I think they're a sort of prime example of both these larger shifts that were happening in philanthropy from the mid-century and then through the 80s and then to the 90s and the 2000s. And also with its own special sort of additional layers of tension around defining community and communal responsibility and Jewish identity, and what of this is specifically Jewish and what of this is universal, right? So there was a very clear case for HIAS's existence that was a sort of uncontroversial in the early years of mass emigration from Eastern Europe, as well as from North Africa and from other sort of regions which have their own Jewish populations. Then you have the post-Holocaust refugee resettlement project. Then you have the Soviet Jewry project. There's this pretty lengthy sequence of obvious needs for resettling people who are Jewishly identified in the United States. Then, once the Soviet Union falls, you have a bit of a raison d'etre crisis, right? If you're HIAS, and it's like, well, who are we serving and why, right? So on the one hand, you have all the same trends that are happening. You have all the same tensions around donors who are sort of less reflexively trusting of nonprofits, who are more who are a bit more rigorous around the control or the discretion and the use of their philanthropic dollars. You have concentration of wealth, right? And therefore it's a sort of narrowing of the band of eligible donors for support. So you have all of these larger forces at play. And then you also have an organization that is not unique, but maybe specifically most potent, having to kind of thread a needle, which it has done magnificently, I have to say, having to sort of thread a needle of saying, we don't just assist refugees and immigrants because we're Jews and they're Jews, right? We do a lot of other kinds of work in the world for different populations of Jewish and non-Jewish refugees, simply for the rationale that we are Jewish, right? And the ability to find that really shifts the types of donors that you attract, right? For every donor that you gain who's really interested in those, in the universal applications of those principles, you also get people who say, that's really not how I see myself as a donor. I want to give money that funds help for Jews by this Jewish institution, Jews defined in a way that feels familiar to me. So again, I go back to what I said before. It's like Jewish philanthropy. It's like all of the same challenges that are that nonprofits and philanthropic institutions and donors face writ large, plus like more special ones that we've come up with because we're who we are.
I just wanted to add, I really appreciate learning a lot from the two of you, but I wanted to just add in terms of philanthropy, philanthropists who are Jewish, instead of the Jewish philanthropy, because again, speaking based on my own experience in these other networks, of which Jewish foundations, whether they be public foundations or family foundations, also their philanthropy was broad in the sense of funding many populations and social justice issues. And so that I think is also a very big part of my experience working with individuals as well as family foundations or funds that I mentioned earlier, that had a very progressive agenda, that were certainly caring about the Jewish community and those needs, but we're also funding broadly in addition to.
Thanks so much, Catherine. So for our next question, I kind of want to get into this idea of the Jewish establishment, which is a concept that is criticized by a lot of activists. And my question is sort of like, how useful is this concept of the establishment for describing like nonprofit groups? And what ways do these institutions wield power and to what effect? And what's the difference between having philanthropies as a target of social protest and activism, as opposed to the state and the government, which I think kind of ties really well into some of the stuff you all have been discussing. Feel free, anyone who wants to chime in first, go ahead.
So this is maybe like three really good questions in one question. So I would define, I look at establishment in a couple of different ways. One is about market capture, right? One is about capturing the market of potential donors, certainly potential large donors. And in there, it's really about capturing the share of potential large donors who have an explicit commitment to Jewish causes, which is a shrinking market already. So that leads to an interesting dynamic that is playing out in institutions that I think have a profile and have the appearance of, because they have these long histories and this longevity, and they really can have this ability to dominate the consciousness of what American Jewish community wants and their priorities, that they appear to be the establishment, right? What is actually happening now is that many of these legacy institutions, and here I'm thinking of like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the JDC, Joint Distribution Committee, AJC. So many of these big, and these are nationwide organizations, and they work internationally, or at least like nationwide. They've now all run, Lila, you brought this up, you brought up endowments before, they've completed, or they're in the middle of like 9-figure endowment campaigns, $100 million, $200 million endowment campaigns. And many of these gifts, so endowments, because of the way they're run, many of those gifts can come from bequests or other planned gifts. And that is really pairing appropriately with the donors that they're trying to reach. They're reaching their generations of donors who have been really loyal and committed for many decades. And at this point, this is like the real big push before that generation dies off, right? And to be able to ensure that that wealth continues and is sort of housed in this structure of perpetuity called an endowment, before the landscape shifts any further, right? And before the market of potential donors shifts any further. So in a way, they're the establishment because they have that name recognition, they have that donor base, they have that lock on public awareness and philanthropic capital. But to me, those endowment campaigns reflect that in some ways they're aware that they may not have the staying power and the juice really to bring in new annual money at the same rate that they're going to need to meet their budget. So in some ways, it's a bit like, we always think that the establishment is like so powerful and they're always like playing offense. And to me, this looks like they're really playing defense, and they're really sort of protecting themselves and protecting their futures in this very like fiscally sort of prudent way. But I think that should be a really good opening for people with more like provocative or radical approaches to what they want to accomplish as philanthropists who identify as Jewish, or philanthropy that they feel is committed to the Jewish people. Yeah, I would like to see, I think if there's anything I would really like to see, it's less about the establishment as being defined as like these top institutions, and more about this sort of concentration of the philanthropic agenda of the Jewish people. Like, to me, the establishment is more of an ideological challenge than it is an institutional challenge. I think breaking the ideological lock that phrases like Jewish continuity, right, have had over like what exactly is the priority for Jewish philanthropy is a really important challenge. And I think there's a very promising window that's opening up, I think, against that sort of ideological monopoly and all of the gatekeeping around what philanthropy is supposed to accomplish, and the sort of very familiar and these kinds of self-fulfilling and self-reinforcing ideologies around the danger of Jews, right? The existential dangers that Jews face around anti-Semitism as like a campus, specifically as like a campus challenge, around Jewish continuity. All of these sort of very familiar, but I think very at times sort of alienating. I think that's our real challenge in terms of taking on the establishment, is broadening the definition of like, what are our priorities? What do we want to use philanthropic money to do? And then the institutional piece is a bit sort of taking care of itself.
Thanks so much, Amy. Lila, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was like so taken, Amy, by how you're talking about this. And I think it's such a helpful framework. You talked about sort of market capture and how these kind of legacy organizations are really scrambling in a certain way. And, I think the phrase, the establishment, is sort of useful only insofar as it's useful to us, right? And, there's plenty of problems with it. And, I don't know too many people who'd be like, yes, I'm the establishment, like, thank you, right? So like, who is it, right? But as you were talking, I was thinking about this Jewish Future Pledge that I just learned about, which was announced, I think it was announced like around March or so, like right around when the pandemic started. And a couple of philanthropists started it. And the basic goal of it is like exactly what you were describing, right? So what they say is that there are $600 billion on the table if Jewish individuals decide that they will allocate 50% of their charitable estates to, quote, Jewish values and or the state of Israel. And the model of the Jewish Future Pledge, like it has a website, you can Google it right now, is exactly the fundamental insecurity that you were describing. And when I heard about it, somebody who was describing it said, really at the end of the day, there's going to be this massive transfer of wealth that's happening, right? You have the kind of baby boomer generation and folks, you know, who made a lot of money in this kind of capitalist explosion of like, you know, late, I guess you could call it late capitalism, I don't know. And that there's going to be this transfer of wealth. And there's this concern that the children of these folks are not going to give to legacy Jewish organizations, are not going to give, forget legacy Jewish organizations, just aren't going to give Jewishly, right? And the folks who started this tell these kinds of stories about like looking at their children and thinking, are they going to give to really keep the Jewish community alive? Are they going to give for the values that matter to me? And if I'm a little concerned, what I can do is create either in spirit or in legally binding ways, my charitable trust, so that 50% of that money in perpetuity has to go to what we might call like establishment Jewish ideas. Or, you know, maybe there's more flexibility. Some would say, you know, Jewish values and or the state of Israel is a really broad sort of thing. But one of the people who's describing this kind of said, look, when I think about this money that I am going to be able to sort of transfer, like it's our money. We made this money. If you want to go out and save the whales, I'm going to tell you, you need to save the Jewish whales, right? And it's just so interesting to think about the insecurity, right? That rests, you know, and some of it is just this basic, like, oh my goodness, we're all mortal. That's scary, right? Like, so you know, and maybe we can get some kind of immortality through this, but also this sense that like, unless we calcify things as they are, and unless we kind of use this like, you know, last run of the power that this money can give us to bind the future in a particular way, then like, that's it for the Jewish future. Like, who the hell knows what's going to happen? So I just thought that was like an example of exactly what you're talking about.
Catherine, do you want to weigh in?
No, I'm going to pass. I think that was pretty comprehensive response.
All right, thanks. So we do have some more planned questions, but I want to get into the Q&A a little bit since we're running towards the end of our hour. One question that got the most votes, this is directed to Lila, but I would encourage all of you to respond if you have something to say, is does the power that Jewish mega donors have over the Jewish communal policy have any earlier roots in Jewish history? Were there any power dynamics like this, for instance, among Jews in early modern Europe, or is this a brand new phenomenon?
It's certainly not. I mean, this sort of touches on what I was saying before, that like you could say this is this timeless emanation of like how any community works when there are differentiations in terms of the distribution of resources, right? So it's, we could certainly look to different, even I'm just thinking about, say, not even early modern Europe, but the more modern period in the 19th century, right, when there were these large Jewish banking families who not only were able to call a lot of the shots in terms of the status that different Jewish communities got in the eyes of state leaders, but also became important figures for state leaders to rely upon because they needed to have the capital lent to them from these banking families, right? So, playing this very particular kind of role where it wasn't just that capital that a banking family might have, controlled gave them power over the Jewish community, but it gave them a certain status in the eyes of whoever the state authority was, which in turn gave them even more authority in the Jewish community. So that, and that happened in different periods in the early modern time as well, right? So it's certainly, not the case that that dynamic is new. But one thing I think that is quite different is that in most of those other contexts, unless we get, much more closer to the present, there really wasn't a robust idea of individual Jewish citizenship, right? There wasn't the idea of having a separate civic identity. And so I think when we think about how philanthropy functions now for Jewish communities in the United States, we need to think about that in light of the way that like a civic identity is also a possibility for American Jews, and individual identity is a possibility for American Jews, and how that shifts the power dynamic.
Great. Any other thoughts before we go to the next question? Okay, we have a question here directed for Catherine. What gap did Astria and North Star fill, and how did they grow out of the social movements? And two, do you see similar dynamics around community within the organizations that you work with?
Yes. Could you repeat that question again? Is it? I didn't see that.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat it, and I can also post it in the chat.
Okay.
So the question is for Catherine. What gaps did Astria and North Star fill? How did they grow out of social movements? And two, do you see similar dynamics around community with the organizations that you work with?
All right. Thank you, Rebecca. So for Estrella, as well as for North Star, the gaps, when you look at the percentage of funding, say for women or LGBTQ folks, even now in 2016, 2018, you see less than 2% of all foundation dollars going to women and girls organizations, and even a smaller percent going to LGBTQ organizations. In the case of North Star, which is part of the whole network of progressive foundations, you would see less money going specifically to organizing and specifically to people of color organizing. So the gap that those foundations filled were to at least lift up the visibility and support with smaller grants, not the same as some of these bigger entities, with smaller grants, the ability for these movements in these communities to do organizing, base building, advocacy. Still underfunded today, but they've had an impact. I think you see the entities, the networks, that both the women's funding networks, the queer networks, as well as the progressive left networks. When you look at them across the board, they've had an impact in their local and in some cases national communities.
Thank you so much for that. Our next top voted question is, what do you see as the impact of US support on the state of Israel on Jewish philanthropy?
Oh God, I muted myself by accident. Oh no, I was not prepared to take that question on first. So, Israel the state of Israel has become this, it's a mythologized, it's sort of this very helpful for providing a mythology of why Jews need to continue to support Judaism and Jewish institutions. It's like a really great representation of the overall aims and the overall challenge of any like Jewish fundraising project, because there's a way of sort of invoking, I think, all of those existential concerns that Lila brought up around vulnerability, around our survival, right? And around our safety and our protection. And our, of course, is like always a contested term of like who is included under our. And so I think more than, the role of Israel is that it's an incredibly effective and useful fundraising appeal. And an incredibly useful rationale for the continued existence and commitment of philanthropic dollars to Jewish institutions.
I feel like I should say something more, but I think that's exactly it, right? Like it gives a certain kind of center, you know, and look, I mean, it's actually like never been the case that American Jews have one opinion about the state of Israel at all. You know, it's never been the case that historically Zionism was one thing at all, right? It was never the case that historically Zionism meant necessarily a particular territory, right? And there is an interesting way in which the kind of philanthropic apparatus that you know, channels a lot of American Jewish dollars to the state of Israel has sort of in a backdoor way created a sense of ideological consensus where there is not one. And you certainly have organizations that are pushing back against that, you know, that are also raising money for the state of Israel for, you know, a whole host of different ideological ideals. But I think on a general level, the kind of diverse ways that American Jews have thought about relating to and having a relationship with the state of Israel have been really flattened because of the preponderance of a few very, very large donors who come to kind of represent what American Jews think about the state of Israel, and they represent it certainly for American political leaders, right? And, you know, it becomes one way that American political leaders think they understand who Jews are and who American Jews are. And, you know, I think in certain ways, this has been quite by design by some of those givers, right? Who want a certain vision of Israel to be advanced and also want a certain kind of status in terms of the sway that they can hold over American politics and are able to sort of leverage both of these together.
Great, that's super helpful. Catherine, do you have anything you want to add?
Oh, thanks.
All right. So I'm going to go back to my sort of planned questions. We have about 10 minutes left. And I'm going to kind of condense what were really originally 2 questions. So I'm sorry if this is a little loaded. So like the Trump administration has seen a tremendous amount of response and community organizing that is organizing resistance to its policies. We've seen a national, you know, Black-led uprising through Black Lives Matter. We've seen tremendous shifts in politics on a sort of grassroots level. And I'm sort of curious, whether we're talking about Jewish philanthropy or philanthropy more broadly, like how are these organizations responding to the Trump administrations, and how are they responding to the movements that are coming out of this moment that are putting very specific demands, often directly on these institutions? I'll leave it to whoever feels ready to start.
Well, I think more of the private foundations and family foundations that identify themselves as more progressive and liberal are actually supporting now these organizations. It's, whether it's groups that are doing immigration rights, women's rights, or in the Black Lives movement. So you see foundations like the Fords, the MacArthur's, the Kelloggs really stepping up their funding and actually funding things that are more, what I would perceive as more radical than they've done in the past, and giving much larger grants. Again, most of those grants are going to some of the larger organizations we might think of as anchor groups, but some of it is trickling down to more of the grassroots. But I think some of the other kinds of foundations that were already funding some of the grassroots are also trying to step that up as well. So I think there is a response, but I think again it's the movements, and it's also, I think, in some of these foundations where over time they've been more inclusive in who's on the staff and who's represented there. So that is also helping in terms of how the funding is getting made and what perspectives are being brought to the table within some of those foundations.
Thank you. Lila, do you want to step in?
Yeah, you know, it's a bit of a puzzle, I think. You know, I'll say, like, when Trump got elected, you know, I thought, wow, I've been spending a lot of time talking about some of these real problems with philanthropy and how it disenfranchises the public, and like, oh my God, if there's a public that voted for this, like, thank goodness that there's this other weapon in the arsenal of, you know, trying to make our world better, right? And so, like, you know, and Catherine just told us some of the ways that these more progressive foundations have been really stepping up, right? And we see, you know, Ford just took out debt basically in order to give at a higher rate than they have in the past. You know, but there's also something like we do need to ask, is this the structure that is going to heal things, right? Like when you have Mike Bloomberg giving $100 million to help register voters in Florida, like, is that the work of democracy? You know, it starts to feel like if the mechanisms and the instruments and the tools that we're using to really like help save our democracy, help make it better, help repair some of these deep injustices are themselves products of those injustices, like, are we ever going to get out of this kind of spinning cycle? You know, and so it's both important, I think, to recognize the fact that there are these private stores of money controlled by people who, yes, have diversified their boards often, and, you know, yes, have really, you know, thought about the deep problems with systemic racism and with, you know, sexual inequality and everything else. Like, it's really important right now that those exist. And yet we also need to ask, how has their existence itself perpetuated some of these problems, right? Like, so we might look at, if you compare the endowments of historically Black colleges and universities, right, to the endowments of, you know, let's say the top 90 American universities that have endowments over $1 billion, like, there's no comparison. Howard has the largest endowment of a historically Black university, and its endowment is 2% of Harvard's, right? Like, so again, you know, it's just one example of how I'm just not sure it's the right move to think that we should rely on these kinds of structures when we're seeing some of these very, very deep-seated problems in our democracy. Like, are these the structures that are going to save us?
Amy?
So in addition to the structures themselves being complicit in many ways in the very phenomena that they'd like to address, which I think what Lila's point is, sometimes some of the most prominent Jewish organizations are using strategies that we might find rather questionable in terms of the expression of, like, how exactly are we adapting to how are we adapting, and what are these Jewish institutions sort of presenting as as what they're calling the Jewish response to increased right threats and increased precarity on a lot of different levels. So, like, one example of this would be that the ADL, and I know, and there are certainly rationales for doing this, but the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, partners with police departments to perform anti-bias trainings. And obviously that comes from a perspective of, you know, better to work within an existing system of law enforcement. I personally find that questionable as the lever of changing, like, the profound and deep injustices and racism that exist in the relationship between people of color and Black people specifically and the police departments across the United States. I don't believe that the approach of anti-bias training has not been proven to really change the behaviors overall within police departments. And so I really question it as the sort of the moderating and harm reduction intervention that can very frequently come out of, you know, influential and sort of, you know, I'm going to call them adaptable Jewish institutions. So, you know, I agree largely that it's a mixed bag, but, you know, in addition to the ways in which private philanthropy is, of course, reinscribed within capitalism, as Lila repeatedly has pointed out correctly, Also, there are ways in which it has increasingly chosen to reinforce and adapt itself to the mechanisms of not just capitalism, but the carceral state. So I find that fairly concerning. The last thing I do want to say is, the way for me out of that self-perpetuating, we're complicit, but then we're somehow alleviating the consequences of the sort of political economy that we're perpetuating. For me, it really starts with much stronger, I think, where your comparison, Lila, is very apt, of like stronger honesty that doesn't coast on, for example, like the role of some rabbis in the civil rights movement, that does not use that as somehow like symbolic or emblematic of how Jews are taking responsibility, Jewish people are taking responsibility for like racial injustice. There's a much more serious reckoning that's required. And I think the faster we let go of this claim to like create to credibility on that based on historical partnerships or historical alliances, the sooner we get to a healthier role for white Jews as allies and for Jews of color as our leaders.
Thanks so much. We're about out of time for this session. I want to thank all of our panelists for a really illuminating conversation. I know I learned a ton that I'm going to be processing for a long time. We have a lot more in the Q&A, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to it. There's some really great questions, but hopefully this doesn't have to be the end of these discussions, and we can keep this going a lot longer in other forms. I want to hand it back over to Hasia, who's going to give some closing remarks, as this is the last panel of this programming.
So I really want to thank everybody who participated tonight and in the previous sessions. I'm going to actually jump off of something Amy just said, because our goal in creating this, and I really shouldn't say our, but Hadass and Natalia's goal, with me as the sort of silent funder behind it, the philanthropist behind it, although not personally, is to ask the question, how do American Jews, since they are our subject here, remember the past, okay, in order to serve their roles in the present, okay? Not what was that past, okay, not explicating it for its own sake, but rather how do they use those memories of the past to advance an agenda in the here and now, and to essentially confirm their power in the communal world, and to shore up the place of Jews in American society. So that was the kind of goal, and it was very important as they prepared the program to have on the screen not a bunch of historians, although a bunch of historians would have been very happy to be here and could have talked endlessly, but to give them a kind of context in which activists and doers and movers and in the contemporary world reflect on the past. And for those contemporary activists to think about, what does history mean to them? What does that Jewish history, what did they learn about that history? And how do they see how it's being used, manipulated, perhaps, is a reasonable word. And again, I'm going off of what Amy had to say there. But on the other hand, for us historians, and we're obviously a very small fraction of the viewers, and even only in each panel, there's only been one historian for a majority of activists, is how do we, when we think about our subjects in who were the past, how do we understand their activism in light of the work being done now by people like Amy and Catherine and all the other amazing participants in the previous sessions? Where's the mutual learning? The historians have not been here to teach, they've been here to learn, as much as I hope the activists have been here to think about how their work in the present has been impacted by the kind of historical narratives which they learned perhaps in university or maybe even earlier, and their engagement with historians now. So we began in the at the turn of the 20th century, when there was essentially a Jewish civil war going on between Jewish workers and Jewish bosses. And we traveled through the 1940s and 50s in the suburbanization and the period of anti-communism. And then in the challenges faced by Jews in the rising Black freedom movement. And we're closing with this really challenging presentation on philanthropy. And each one was this beautiful synergy between historians and even though historians are also in the world, but historians and activists in the world. So I hope that everybody who's participated will take away from this visions of how they're going to do their work. And I hope all the people in the audience will continue to think about what they heard, and may 1,000 conferences and programs flower as a result of what Jewish Currents has done for us, and from what Hadass Binyamini and Natalia Shevin collectively or jointly put together. So good night, everybody. And it's really been fabulous. And